The year was 1878, and the silence of the Texas plains was a living thing. For Elias Vance, it was a constant companion, a heavy blanket woven from dust and grief. His ranch was a scratch upon the vast, unforgiving canvas of the land, a testament to 5 years of relentless labor and a loneliness so profound it had its own weight. The wind, his only regular visitor, howled around the corners of his small, sturdy cabin, speaking a language of desolation he understood perfectly. It whispered of loss, of the grave on the low hill where his wife Martha lay, taken by a fever that had burned through their dreams like a prairie fire. Elias was a man whittled down to his essential parts. The softness had been scoured from him by sun and sorrow, leaving behind a framework of quiet competence and unending routine. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, his movements economical and practiced. He mended fences that the land and the cattle seemed determined to destroy, drew water from a well that threatened to run dry each summer, and tended to his small herd with a grim dedication that had little to do with hope and everything to do with simply continuing. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his property, his heart to the size of a stone in his own chest. He had come here with Martha, full of plans for a future that bloomed as brightly as the wildflowers after a spring rain. They had built the cabin together, their laughter echoing in the frame before the walls went up. Her hands had planted the stubborn little garden that he now neglected, its withered vines a daily reminder of all that had perished. After she was gone, the silence she left behind was louder than any storm. He filled it with work, pushing his body until exhaustion brought a dreamless sleep, for it was only in dreams that her ghost came to visit, her presence a sweet agony he could no longer bear. His trips into the settlement of Redemption were infrequent and born of pure necessity. Redemption was a name that promised far more than the place delivered. It was a clot of dusty buildings on the artery of a cattle trail, populated by men whose faces were hard with opportunism and women whose eyes held a weary resignation. It was a place of loud noises and raw whiskey, of casual cruelty and desperate bargains. Elias hated it. He hated the way the men looked at him, their gazes a mixture of pity for his widower status and suspicion of his solitude. He was an outsider, a man who kept to himself, and in a place like Redemption, that was a sin second only to weakness. On a blistering August day, when the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, the last of his flour ran out. With a heavy sigh, he saddled his horse, a stoic roan named Gideon, and began the long ride. The sun beat down on his hat, and the dust kicked up by Gideon's hooves coated the back of his throat. He felt the familiar dread coil in his gut as the ramshackle buildings of the town appeared on the horizon, a mirage of misery hardening into reality. He tied Gideon to the hitching post outside the general store, his mind already calculating the quickest way to get his supplies and leave. But the usual low hum of the town was different today. There was a current of excitement, a foul energy that drew men from the saloon and the blacksmith's forge like flies to rotting meat. A crowd had gathered in the dusty expanse between the store and the saloon, their voices a low, jeering rumble. Curiosity was a feeling Elias had buried long ago, but a sense of unease pulled him forward. He moved to the edge of the crowd, his height giving him a clear view of the grotesque spectacle at its center. A large, sweat-stained man named Garrett Shaw, a freight hauler with a reputation for brutality, stood on the back of a wagon. Beside him, small and still, stood a figure. It was a woman, he could tell by the shape of her, but her head was covered by a coarse, filthy burlap sack, a rope tied loosely around her neck. Her hands were bound in front of her. She wore the tattered remnants of a deerskin dress, and her bare feet were caked in dust and bleeding from small cuts. "What we have here, gentlemen," Shaw boomed, his voice slick with self-satisfaction, "is a genuine Comanche savage. Caught her myself, skulking near my camp up on the Brazos. A real prize." A wave of murmurs and crude laughter went through the crowd. Elias felt a cold sickness rise in his throat. He had heard of such things, raiders capturing native women and selling them off in backwater towns, but he had never witnessed it. The sheer, unadorned ugliness of it was staggering. The men were not just buying a person, they were buying a story to tell, a trophy of their perceived superiority. "She's broke, mostly," Shaw continued, giving the rope a little tug that made the woman stumble. "Good for cooking, cleaning, whatever else a man might need a squaw for. What am I bid? Let's start at $5. $5 for a lifetime of service." The bidding was slow and laced with lewd jokes. Men shouted out numbers, their bids as much a performance for each other as a genuine attempt to buy. Elias watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He saw not a savage, but a human being humiliated, stripped of dignity, and turned into chattel. The burlap sack was the most obscene part of it all. It denied her a face, a name, an identity. It made her an object, a thing to be owned. He thought of Martha, of her fierce pride and gentle spirit. What if it had been her? The thought was a hot poker to his soul. He should have turned away. He should have gotten his flour and ridden back to the quiet misery of his ranch. It was not his affair. He had enough burdens of his own. But his feet remained planted in the dust, his eyes fixed on the still, sacked figure on the wagon bed. He saw the slight tremor in her bound hands, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. The bidding stalled at $2. The men were losing interest, their thirst for novelty slaked. Shaw was growing impatient. $2, is that all? It's a disgrace, he spat. Elias didn't know what moved him. It wasn't courage, and it wasn't righteousness. It was something deeper, a flicker of the man he had been before grief had hollowed him out. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal to let this ugliness stand unchallenged in his presence. His voice, when it came out, was rusty from disuse, but it cut through the murmuring crowd. $1. A stunned silence fell. The men turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and contempt. Garrett Shaw squinted, his piggy eyes narrowing. "What was that, Vance?" "I said $1. Elias repeated, his voice firmer now. He met Shaw's gaze without flinching. It was an insult, a bid so low it mocked the entire proceeding. Shaw's face flushed a dark, angry red. He opened his mouth to curse Elias out, but then a different look crossed his face, a cunning, malicious smile. To sell her for such a pittance to the town's somber hermit would be a greater humiliation for the woman and a story in itself. $1 it is, Shaw declared with a laugh. Sold. To the lonely farmer, Elias Vance. Get your property, you fool. The crowd parted for Elias as he walked toward the wagon, their whispers and snickers following him like burrs. He ignored them. He pulled a single, worn silver dollar from his pocket and tossed it onto the wagon bed. It landed with a soft clink that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He didn't look at Shaw. He looked only at the woman. With his pocket knife, he reached out and sawed through the thick rope binding her wrists. Then, gently, he took the other rope from around her neck. He gestured with his head toward Gideon. "Come." The journey back to the ranch was a long, silent procession. The woman followed him, her steps light and steady, despite her bare feet. Elias did not look back, but he could feel her presence behind him, a small, constant shadow in the overwhelming heat. The weight of his impulsive act began to settle on him. What had he done? He had no place for another person, no words for a stranger, no room in his shuttered heart for anything but the ghosts that already lived there. He had bought a human being for the price of a sack of flour. The shame of it burned hotter than the sun. When they reached the ranch, the familiar landscape felt alien. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a tense, uncertain presence. He dismounted and led Gideon to the trough, his movements stiff and awkward. The woman stood near the porch, her head still shrouded in that wretched sack, her posture as still and watchful as a hawk's. He didn't know what to do. He pointed toward the small, clean barn. "You can stay in there," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "There's a cot, a blanket, I'll bring you water and food." She gave no sign that she had heard or understood. He went about his chores with a mechanical slowness, his mind racing. He brought a bucket of fresh water from the well and a plate with a piece of cornbread and some dried jerky, leaving them just inside the barn door. He retreated to his cabin, closing the door behind him as if it could shut out the complication he had just invited into his life. He sat at his small table, staring at the rough wood grain, until the sun began to sink and the cabin filled with shadows. He couldn't leave her like that. He couldn't let her spend the night with that sack over her head. It was an emblem of her humiliation, and now his own. Taking a deep breath, he walked back to the barn. The plate of food was untouched, but the water level in the bucket was lower. She was standing in the center of the barn, exactly where he had last seen her, a sentinel in the gathering gloom. He approached her slowly, his hands held open and away from his body to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, "but it has to come off." She remained perfectly still. He reached out with hesitant fingers, his touch light as he grasped the bottom edge of the burlap. He paused, giving her a chance to pull away, to resist. She did not move. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the sack. The last of the evening light, golden and soft, spilled through the open barn door and fell upon her face. And Elias Vance, for the first time in 5 years, forgot how to breathe. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was. Her face was a sculpture of proud angles and resilient planes, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her eyes dark, deep, and utterly unreadable. But it was not her beauty that struck him dumb. It was the ferocious, untamed dignity in her expression. There was no fear in her eyes, only a watchful intelligence. There was no submission, only an immense, defiant pride that had not been broken on the back of a wagon or bought for a single coin. In her face, he saw the vast, wild plains, the unyielding strength of the ancient hills, the story of a people who could not be erased. In that single, silent moment, something shifted inside him. His action in the town, which had felt like a moment of reckless pity, was transformed. It was no longer about saving a victim. It was about honoring a survivor. A silent, solemn vow took root in his heart. It wasn't a marriage of church or law, but a covenant of the soul, made in the dusty half-light of a barn. He would not be her master, he would be her shield. He would protect this flame of defiance until she was ready to find her own way again. He had paid $1 not for a slave, but for the chance to restore a piece of a shattered world, and in doing so, perhaps, to restore a piece of his own. The days that followed were a study in silence. Elias established a new routine, one that now included a second, silent person. He would leave food and water on the porch of the cabin in the morning and evening. He moved a spare mattress and his late wife's quilt into the barn, creating a more comfortable space for her. He never entered the barn while she was there, affording her the privacy it was in his power to give. Her name, he learned, was Topsana. He didn't learn it from her lips, not at first. He had tried speaking to her a few times, simple words in English, but she remained silent, her dark eyes following his every move with an unnerving stillness. She was a ghost who cast a shadow, a presence defined by her quiet observation. She never strayed far from the barn, her world contained within the small sphere of his ranch, a prisoner of a freedom she did not yet trust. He found out her name from a small, almost imperceptible clue. He had been mending a harness near the corral, his fingers clumsy, and had dropped his awl. He searched the dust for a few frustrating minutes before giving up and heading back to the cabin. The next morning, the awl was sitting on the porch railing, right where he would see it. Beside it, drawn in the dust with a fingertip, was a delicate, intricate shape, the image of a prairie flower. He didn't understand its meaning until later that week when he was cleaning out a small chest of Martha's things. He found a book on local flora and fauna. Flipping through the pages, he saw it the same flower. The caption underneath read Topsana, the Comanche word for it. It was a beginning, a communication without words. He began to leave things for her, not out of necessity, but as offerings. A length of blue calico cloth he'd bought on his last trip to town. A small comb carved from bone. He left them on the porch, and they would disappear, taken in silence. In return, small things would appear for him. A tear in his work shirt, mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. A loose handle on an axe, expertly tightened and secured with a strip of rawhide. They were building a language of gestures, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their two worlds. Elias found himself watching her, not with the eyes of an owner, but with a growing sense of wonder. He watched her move with a fluid grace that seemed to mock the harsh, angular landscape. He saw her studying the plants that grew wild at the edge of his property, her fingers gently touching leaves and petals as if greeting old friends. He saw her watching the sky, her face tilted up to read the clouds and the flight of birds in a way he never could. She possessed a knowledge of the land that he, for all his years of toil, could never hope to match. He was a trespasser here. She was a part of it. The change in him was slow, almost imperceptible at first. The crushing weight of his loneliness began to lift, replaced by a new kind of quiet. It was a shared quiet, no longer empty, but filled with a watchful presence. He started talking again, not directly to her, but to himself, to Gideon, to the world at large. He would describe the task he was doing, or comment on the weather, his voice filling the space between them. He never expected a reply, and he never received one. But he had the distinct feeling that he was being listened to. The first true crack in the wall of silence came with the storm. It blew in from the north without warning, a churning mass of black clouds that turned the afternoon sky to night. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets, and hail the size of pebbles hammered the earth. Elias rushed to get the cattle into their small shelter, fighting against the gale. As he struggled to bar the gate, he saw her. Topsana was standing in the open doorway of the barn, her figure silhouetted against the gloom, watching the violent sky. He shouted over the roar of the wind, "Get inside, it's not safe." He didn't think she would obey, but as a tremendous crack of lightning split the sky, followed by an immediate, deafening clap of thunder, she flinched. He saw a tremor run through her body, a flicker of the terror she kept so well hidden. Without thinking, he ran from the corral to the barn, grabbed her arm, and pulled her toward the relative safety of the cabin. He half-pushed her through the door and slammed it shut against the raging storm, plunging the small room into near darkness. For a long moment, they stood there, breathing heavily, the sound of the wind and rain a deafening roar outside. Rainwater dripped from their hair and clothes, forming puddles on the wooden floor. Elias moved to the fireplace and struck a match. The kindling caught, and a small, flickering light pushed back the shadows. He turned to look at her. She was huddled near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide. The storm had stripped away her careful composure, revealing a raw vulnerability. "It will pass," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked at him, and for the first time her gaze was not just watchful but questioning. She took a hesitant step toward the fire, drawn to its warmth. Elias moved away, giving her space, and sat at his table. They spent the next hour in that small, enclosed world, a silent truce declared against the fury outside. The storm was a shared enemy, and in their shared shelter they were, for a moment, equals. When the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening, the tension between them had changed. It was no longer a taut wire of mistrust, but something more pliant, more uncertain. A few nights later, Elias was woken by a sound from his own throat-choked cry. He was tangled in his blankets, his heart pounding, the ghost of a nightmare clinging to him. It was the dream of Martha, her face pale with fever, her hand growing cold in his. He sat up, breathing hard, and ran a shaky hand over his face. A faint sound from outside his window made him freeze. He looked and saw her silhouette standing near the cabin. She had heard him. Shame washed over him. He had shown a weakness he kept hidden from the world. He expected her to be gone by morning, repelled by his brokenness. But when he opened his door at dawn, she was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. As he emerged, she stood up. She looked at him, then spoke a single word, her voice low and raspy, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. Elias. It was his name, the first word she had ever spoken to him. It was not a question or a statement, but an acknowledgement. She had seen his pain, and she had not run from it. He nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Topsana, he replied, speaking her name aloud for the first time. It was as if a dam had broken. The words did not come in a flood, but in a slow, steady trickle. She began to speak to him in a mixture of broken English and Comanche words, which he slowly began to piece together. She told him of the raid on her camp, of the terror and the chaos, of being torn from her family. She spoke of her husband, a warrior named Kuruk, and her small son, Ahanu, and how she did not know if they were alive or dead. Her grief was a raw, open wound, and in sharing it, she gave Elias permission to touch his own. He found himself telling her about Martha. He spoke of her laughter, of the way she believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He talked about the plans they had, the children they had hoped for. He spoke until his voice was raw, unearthing memories he had buried for years. In the quiet presence of this woman who had lost everything, he could finally mourn. Their shared sorrow became the soil in which a new kind of understanding grew. They were two solitary survivors, two people scarred by the cruelties of the world, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other's presence. The ranch was no longer just his place of exile, it was becoming their sanctuary. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. Word of Elias Vance and his Comanche squaw had festered in the bitter heart of redemption. It was a story told with winks and sneers in the saloon, a dark piece of gossip that fed the town's inherent prejudice. Garrett Shaw, in particular, felt cheated. He had intended the woman for a life of brutal servitude, and the thought of her living in peace with the strange, quiet farmer was an insult to his authority. He saw it as a challenge, one he intended to answer. One hot, still afternoon, Elias saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before he heard the horses. He knew, with a sinking certainty, who it was. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall, his movements calm and deliberate. "Go inside the cabin," he told Topsana, who was tending to a small patch of herbs she had planted near the porch. "Lock the door." She looked from his face to the approaching riders, and a grim understanding passed between them. She nodded, her face a mask of composure, and slipped inside the cabin, the heavy bar thudding into place. Elias stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. 4 riders pulled up, led by Garrett Shaw. Their faces were flushed with whiskey and self-righteous anger. "Vance," Shaw spat, staying on his horse to loom over him. "We heard some disturbing things. Heard you were living out here in sin with that savage." "What I do on my land is my own business, Shaw," Elias said, his voice level. "Not when it offends decent folk," another man chimed in. "It ain't right. We've come to take her. We'll find a proper place for her." The lie was so bold it was almost laughable. Their intentions were written plainly on their leering faces. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. "She's not going anywhere." Shaw laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She ain't got a choice, and neither do you. We paid for her once, in a manner of speaking. She belongs to the town now." He started to dismount, a clear threat in his movement. "She is my wife." The words left Elias's mouth before he had consciously formed them. They were a shield, a claim, a truth forged in silence and shared grief. The men stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence. Shaw recovered first, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and rage. "Your wife? You married a redskin?" He spat on the ground. You're sicker than I thought, Vance. That changes nothing. We're taking her. As Shaw took a step forward, the cabin door opened. Topsana stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a weapon. She was holding the blue calico cloth he had given her, now sewn into a simple but elegant shawl. She stood beside Elias, her head held high, her gaze sweeping over the men with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Her presence was not that of a cowering victim, but of a queen surveying a pack of mongrels. Her silent defiance was more potent than any threat. It enraged Shaw. He lunged for the porch, his hand reaching for her. It was the last step he took. Elias moved with a speed that belied his quiet nature. He didn't raise the rifle to shoot. He used it as a club, swinging the heavy stock in a short, brutal arc that connected with Shaw's side. The man grunted, a sharp exhalation of pained surprise, and staggered back. The other men, startled by the sudden violence from the placid farmer, hesitated. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice a low growl of absolute conviction. He raised the rifle, this time leveling the barrel at Shaw's chest. "She is Mrs. Vance. This is her home. Anyone who tries to harm her will answer to me. Now get, and don't ever come back." There was no madness in his eyes, only a cold, deadly seriousness. The men looked at Elias, then at the silent, proud woman beside him, and they saw not two broken people, but a unified, unbreachable front. They were bullies, not warriors. The fight had gone out of them. Muttering curses, they helped the wheezing Shaw back onto his horse and rode away, their retreat a cloud of resentful dust. Elias stood there until they were out of sight, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He slowly lowered the rifle. He turned and looked at Topsana. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on his. The declaration he had made, "She is my wife," hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. She reached out and laid her hand gently on the barrel of the rifle, pushing it down. Then her fingers brushed the back of his hand. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate, gentle affection. In that small, simple gesture, an entire volume of understanding was conveyed. The vow he had made in the barn had now been spoken aloud to the world, and she, with her touch, had accepted it. The aftermath of the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace. The threat from the town receded, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect for the man who had defended his home so fiercely. Elias and Topsana were left to their sanctuary, their bond now sealed by shared danger and public commitment. Their life together took on a new rhythm. The silence between them was now one of comfort, not caution. They worked side by side, their movements a practiced dance of mutual support. She taught him the language of the land, which roots were for medicine, which berries were for dye, how to read the coming weather in the turn of a leaf. He, in turn, shared the small pieces of his own world, reading to her from one of Martha's books in the evenings by the firelight, explaining the strange mechanics of the world he came from. They spoke of their losses, not as fresh wounds, but as scars that told the stories of who they were. Her grief for her lost family remained, a deep, quiet river running beneath the surface of her life. His sorrow for Martha softened from a sharp pain to a gentle, bittersweet memory. They did not replace what they had lost. Instead, they built something new in the space that grief had cleared. One evening, a year after she had arrived, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the herbs from her garden. She had been weaving a basket from willow branches, her fingers moving with an innate, graceful skill. "Elias," she said, her voice soft in the twilight. "In the language of my people there is no word for goodbye. We say, 'I will see you again.' I think maybe I will not see my son again in this life." It was a quiet admission of a hope finally laid to rest. Elias reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I am sorry, Topsana," he whispered. She turned her hand over and held his tightly. "But my home, it was taken from me, and now I have a home here." She looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not just pride and resilience, but a deep and abiding love. It was a love that had grown slowly, quietly, like a hardy flower pushing its way through rocky soil. He looked around at the small ranch, at the cabin that had once been his prison of sorrow. It was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the smell of her cooking, with the sight of her handiwork. It was a home again. He had paid $1 for a woman in a sack, an act of desperate, unthinking compassion, and in return she had given him back his life. The wind still whispered across the plains, but it no longer spoke of desolation. It sang a new song now, a song of two solitary souls who had found each other in the vast, empty wilderness and built a world together. A quiet testament to the enduring power of kindness and the unexpected resilience of the human heart.